Or something? Okay, thanks Bob. So this lecture is about the history of Samba as a case study to illustrate some of the things you've learnt in the other lectures in this course. In the previous lectures I've already discussed a bit of the history of Samba to illustrate some particular features, but now I'll give you a more in-depth history and particularly some of the stranger incidents that have happened over the years in the Samba project. But I would like to point out that the strange incidents are not the norm. The project has been going for about 18 years now, or nearly 18 years, and usually it's just sending patches, committing code, writing code, developing documentation, etc. So I don't want to give you the impression that free software projects are always hitting the types of strange things I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. Anyway, what is Samba? Samba is a file, print and authentication server which is compatible with the protocols used by Microsoft Windows. That means you can install a Samba server on your free operating system or your non-free operating system. It runs on all different Unix-like operating systems. And it means that Windows machines can then access the files and printers and be authenticated by the Unix server. So very useful in environments where you have a lot of Windows desktops and you might have some Unix-like servers, for example Linux servers or HPUX or AAX or Solaris or whatever. Okay, who uses it? It's widely used by many companies, government departments, university home users. We don't know how many users there are, but we think there's quite a few. It's widely used also in embedded forms in NAS devices, and that may in fact make up the majority of Samba users. There's a lot of little embedded NAS boxes, the little sort of brick-like devices or shoebox-shaped devices quite often, which contain a hard drive and a little embedded computer and a network port, and you plug it in, you get instant storage on your network. A lot of those devices, not all of them, but a lot of them have Samba inside them, plus lots of other pieces of free software. I mean, Samba is useless without the operating system around it. So there's lots of contributions from various segments of the free software community to make it possible to build boxes like that. Who develops it? There's a core team. We have the concept of a project team. If you remember from the project governance lecture yesterday, I talked about different project structures. The current structure for the Samba project is a team, and there's about 15 active members. There were about 30 odd in total over the years there's been. Some of those are now not very active and don't tend to make many contributions these days, and that's quite normal. You know, people have different priorities at different stages of their careers and their lives. And at the moment we have about 15 who are reasonably active and have done a number of commits, in some cases a very large number of commits in the last year. We have in some developers who do an amazing amount of work. Some of the ones in Europe and Jeremy Allison in the United States do an amazing amount of work on Samba. We also have lots of community contributors, and about 40 odd community contributors in the last year from looking at our Git log. So about 40 external people have made significant contributions. There's more people who've made small contributions, but about 40 have made somewhat significant contributions. And those people, of course, if they continue to make significant contributions over time, they would eventually be invited to become part of the core team. That's how we do it. It's based on us learning to trust their patches, learning to trust their judgment, and then we invite them to join the team, and they get a t-shirt, and they get the ability to spend more of their life writing free software for everyone else, which is great. So we average about 25 commits per day in total. So about 25 times a day, somebody commits some new code to the main branch of Samba. There's far more than that are committed to alternative branches, to testing versions of Samba, private experimental branches. About 25 times a day, a patch arrives in the main branch, which means it would then be part of a release that is coming up into the future. The early days, Samba wasn't always that big a project. It started off with a procrastinating student, that was me, and I was supposed to be writing a thesis, and being the typical PhD student, I wanted to avoid writing my thesis at all costs, and so I procrastinated. And so I was tempted by a a call that DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation. Anyone remember Digital Equipment Corporation? Made faxes and that sort of thing? Yep. So Digital Equipment Corporation put out an announcement that they were asking for beta testers for a product called Windex. Right? Its name later changed, but it was originally called Windex.
Some of the cupboard at home.
You've got some in the cupboard at home for cleaning the windows, indeed. Well, they changed their name later, but originally it was called Windex when it was in beta. And Windex was an ex-Windows server for Microsoft Windows. And it allowed you to display an X-Window desktop on your Windows PC. And so, of course, you know, when this beta test call came out, it was free. You got to try a new shiny bit of software. Any self-restricting PhD student would jump at the chance. You know, great fun, completely unrelated to my thesis topic, but hey, looked like fun. So I said yes, and I received a copy of it, and I installed it, and I reported some bugs, and all that was great fun. Anyway, but then I discovered that Windex would not work with PCNFS. I was in the department of, I was actually in the Computer Sciences Laboratory here at ANU, and the Computer Sciences Laboratory had a Sunos 4.1.3, I think, server. So all my files were stored on that server. And normally when I was running a Windows desktop, I would access those files using the NFS protocol, using the PCNFS package running on Windows, which is this proprietary NFS implementation for Windows. Now it turned out that when I installed Windex, I couldn't at the same time run PCNFS because they used a different implementation of the TCP/IP stack. That means while I was beta testing this product, I couldn't access any of my files, I couldn't go and read, you know, my mail off the server. I couldn't do all sorts of things, right? And so that was disastrous. So of course, what I decided I needed to do was to write an implementation of DEC PathWorks. This Windex product did include a file sharing capability, but it could only talk to DECstation servers, which is this Ultrix. Instead of Solaris Sunos, it could talk to this Ultrix server. So I thought, hey, it can't be too hard to create the equivalent of that server for Sunos. And so I thought, okay, I'll spend a week or two and write myself a file server for Sunos that's compatible with this one that this beta testing Windex works with. And so I started on that.
Did you get source with Windex?
No source for Windex, and no source for the server either. This was all proprietary software I was running. I was running Microsoft Windows on the desktop. Proprietary Unix on the servers, proprietary implementation of DEC PathWorks, but I thought this would be fun to write an implementation of this compatible file server so that I could then do the beta testing without having to reboot all the time to go between PCNFS and Windex. So I looked at the protocol on the wire, stared at the packets for a while, and wrote the initial version late in December 1991, and that's what was called Server 0.1, and it allowed me to access the files on a Sunos server from a box running the Windex beta version from DEC. Anyway, so I then announced that in a couple of weeks later, January 1992, after I'd got back from the Christmas break, I then announced to the world, hey, if anyone wants to use this, if you're running PathWorks for DOS, and you have any Suns or other Unix boxes, you may be interested in a generic file server I've written that will allow the use of file services from many different Unixes. It is available from yarp.anu.edu.au in the directory pub/nb server. And Yarp was a FTP server run by Mark Cobalt. His name? Mark Cobalt. So he ran that server, and he kindly published the copy of Server 0.1 in that directory, and anyone could download it. So that was the first announcement. So in the early days, it was a hobby project. So in the classification of projects that we'll be looking at in this course, this was a one-person hobby project. It was a bit of fun. It was only a couple of thousand lines of C code, very primitive, no website. Well, there weren't any websites in those days. The web really didn't exist. And was released as a UU encoded tarball. There were no binaries. There was 100-odd lines of cryptic README. There was a very simplistic non-profit license that I showed you in the licensing lecture that I just made up myself. I didn't have any grand plans. The code quality was awful. This was my first network program I'd ever written. So I'd never done any socket programming or network programming, and I hadn't actually done a computer science degree. I'd done a physics degree. And if you ever look at code written by physicists, it's often quite terrible, and my code was no exception. It was terrible. It's available now if you want to go and look at the old version. That original version's up on the Samba site under old versions if you wanted to see just how bad the code was. Okay, so why did it succeed? Well, it was immediately useful. People got feedback when they downloaded it. It was buggy, of course, right? But they could download it, they could follow the instructions, they could compile it, and it did something. They got some positive reward from trying it. And hey, it might have corrupted some of their files, and hey, you know, the directory listings weren't always complete, and this sort of thing, but they got some positive feedback. And the bugs encouraged people to contribute. Other people would then say, oh yes, I've worked out how to make it that it can list directories longer than 100 entries, you know, I've worked out how it can do this or do that. Here's a patch. And that started happening. It was very easy to hack on because it was only about 2,000 lines of C, so you could just page through it and read the entire code base in half an hour, no problem. Very, very simple code. Horrible code, but simple. Very, very simple. And it was free. And so there was no qualms about, proprietary licenses and NDAs. And so they're the key attributes. The project became a success. Okay, then I abandoned it. Right? And this happens in free software projects. The department, I was scratching an itch. I needed to be able to access this server while running this beta test. I stopped doing the beta test. Plus, the computer sciences laboratory here at ANU switched away to running X terminals rather than Windows. I no longer had Windows on my desktop. Right? I had an X terminal instead, right? A dedicated terminal. To access the Sun server. That meant I couldn't run this software. Well, I couldn't connect to it anyway because I didn't have any client to connect to it anymore. So I didn't need it. So I announced the end of my involvement. I sent out a message saying, hi, I'm no longer interested in developing it. If anyone else wants to continue maintenance, then you're welcome to. And nobody volunteered. The project was dead. It was gone. So then there was this thing called Linux that came along. And that revived lots of things. It was starting to gain ground around that time in sort of late 1992, and the Linux community needed a way to connect Linux boxes to Windows PCs. And somebody remembered my project and contacted me. And that was Dan Shearer from the University of South Australia in Adelaide. He and I have been good friends ever since. So he contacted me, and what happened actually was he told me about Linux and about the interest in my project, and that converted me to Linux. So I got involved in the Linux project, but I still had no need for that server that I'd worked on because I was now running a Linux desktop. I still didn't have any Windows desktop. I didn't have any particular reason to connect to this server. So I still didn't work on it, but I did start using Linux and it was great. Okay, so it was still abandoned. Then another colleague at ANU, Carl Auer, told me about somebody who was selling some really cheap network cards. I think they were $15 each or something for a 3C505 network card. That's the slightly longer one. 3C505 network card. And there happened to be a whole lot of cable sitting in a dumpster at the back of one of the buildings at ANU, which they were throwing out, networking cable. So that meant for $30 for buying 2 cards and retrieving a bunch of discarded cable out of the back of the dumpster, I could create a home network. And I could be right on the bleeding edge of technology and have a network at home. And so I then had 2 PCs at home, my wife had one as well, and she ran Windows. So finally I had a reason. I had a reason to be able to connect again. I also received an email from somebody telling them that my server worked with the DOS Landman client rather than the Digital Pathworks client. They said it worked with this old Landman client that Microsoft had put out. Instead of digital, it was a Microsoft client. And I was very skeptical. I thought, that can't work. This is a proprietary digital protocol that I've implemented. How can it work with the Microsoft client, which is bound to be some other different proprietary protocol? Anyway, I tried it. I downloaded the free DOS Landman client and put it on Sue's PC. This was before Windows had built-in file sharing. You had to download it as an add-on. And I connected it to my Linux box, and I was absolutely stunned when I was able to get a directory listing and copy some files around. So, oh great, I'll revive that old project and I'll start working on it again. So I needed to scratch the itch again, right? The itch came back. So I had a new itch to scratch and connectivity on my home LAN. I announced this grandiose project, the NetBIOS for Unix project. So if you search with Google for NetBIOS for Unix project and my name, you'll find the announcement in December 1993. At that point also, this was after the time when Dan Shearer had introduced me to Linux. And I was sold on the idea of what was being done. And I was very, very impressed in particular with the GNU C compiler, which is this marvelous free compiler, and the Linux kernel. And they both use the GNU General Public License. So I thought, great, I'll use the same license. And I adopted that license for my project. And so the project lived once more. Okay, then development started happening really rapidly. A whole lot of people in the GNU Linux community got involved in helping out with the project. In particular, there was one person, Jeremy Allison, who had been interested in writing his own SMB server, which is what Samba is, and he'd been asking about for documentation on how to write the protocol, how to write an implementation of it, and he stumbled across my project and decided to contribute. And Jeremy is now one of my closest friends, and he's been a contributor to the project ever since. And in fact, he probably does more work on Samba than pretty much anyone else in the project. And he's stuck to the Samba project through numerous companies over the years, an enormous contributor. So I consider him sort of be the co-author of Samba now, really, because he's worked on it for so long and contributed so much. So his very rapid development in 1993 and 1994. I showed you the changelog the other day, where I was doing releases, often several releases in a day. Of course, this meant that my PhD studies were essentially stalled, because when you're doing 3 or 4 package releases a day of a FOSS project, you don't get a lot of time to write your thesis. But I managed to do just enough to keep my supervisors fooled into not throwing me out of the university, and the project flourished. The code grew about, in 1 year, the size of the code grew by about a factor of 15, both from myself writing code and from other people contributing code. Large numbers of contributions started coming in, but the percentage of the code that I'd written, shrunk and shrunk as more and more people contributed. And new releases averaged every few days, sometimes several a day. We created a mailing list on a machine called Arbeitsjahrs, which is sitting under my desk at ANU, and a whole lot of people joined the mailing list and started contributing. So why did it take off at this point? Why did it get so many people using it? There was a very fast release cycle, extremely fast. That really feeds the early development of a project. If at the beginning of a project you only do releases every now and again, it won't take off. You've got to do really fast releases, get something out early. As soon as a bug is fixed, new release. And you need to automate the release process. You create a script so that to do a release, you just go, release.sh space and version number, and it's done. It's up on the website, everything's done, everything's updated. Create that script so that a new release is just a few seconds work. That's great. People love seeing those new releases coming out all the time. You can even automate the announcement, sending out the email with an announcement out of the mailing list, new release is out, and the version and the changelog, and here automatically grab the changelog and throw it up on the announcement list. Careful crediting of contributions. I had a changelog. This was before we were using source code management systems. There were source code management systems available at the time, but I didn't know how to use them. And I didn't know the benefits of them. I'd never been taught anything like that. And so I just used tarballs and diff and patch, because I'd learnt about diff and patch. And so I used a changelog, but I carefully noted every contribution. So if you have a look at the original changelog, Samba old versions, if I pull up something like this version here and look at this changelog, then you can see that every change, every release, I sort of say, now if it doesn't say a credit to someone, that means I did it. Okay, so for example here on December 93, Brian at alex.com, he did change the make connection not to lowercase the password. Thanks to Brian at alex.com. And fixed the accept bug not initializing in address length. Thanks to bogstad at cs.jhu.edu, etc. So just doing that gave people credit, right? So they appreciated that their input was appreciated, and they're more likely to contribute more. And it got more and more contributors as it came along. You can see in that release, the majority of work in that release was done by other people. I got all the credit. Well, I tried to give them credit, but of course everyone assumed it was my project. That is something you have to watch out for as a project leader. Often, users give too much credit to the project leader. And the project leader needs to in turn be careful to credit the other people who contribute so they don't think the project leader is hogging the limelight. Because really, once a project starts getting successful, the project leader has a smaller and smaller role in the actual development of the code. They usually are still a major developer, but it's a smaller and smaller proportion of the code that they've written themselves. And you've got to make sure that you continue giving the credit to the other people, otherwise you'll lose them, and you won't get those continued contributions.
Were you manually editing that text file every
Yes.
time you put something into the...
Yes, I didn't have a source code management system, so I was manually editing that every time I patched something in. I'd open up this change file, and I'd include that file in every release.
Right.
And then when I did an announcement of release, I would just cut and paste that and put it up on the mailing list, and that's the release announcement.
Yeah.
Right, so that's exactly what people would see.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at the archives of the mailing list, you'll just see each of these coming out. Yep. Okay, so each release worked to some extent. You know, I did do minimal testing that at least compiled, and people could at least connect to it and do something with each release. Not all of them worked very well, but they worked to some extent. And if it didn't work all that well, hey, there was probably another release later in the day anyway that fixed it. Active project maintainer. In the early days, you have to have an active project maintainer to really push things along. Okay, commercial attention. This is now skipping forward a little bit. This is the first commercial attention that we got with this project. The project that was originally called Server, I wasn't very imaginative in my names. I changed its name to NB Server when I discovered it was something to do with the NetBIOS protocol. Because I'd worked out the protocol from the wire, I didn't know what the protocol was called that I was implementing. And I vaguely got this idea it might be something to do with NetBIOS. Turns out I was wrong, it was actually SMB. So I changed from Server to NB Server, and when I learnt that, I changed the project's name again to SMB Server, and that's when the first lawyers got involved. Because this company called Syntax Corp in April 1994, they made a very expensive proprietary SMB server. And there were quite a few organisations and companies around Canberra and all over the world that used this commercial SMB server called Syntax. I knew various government departments here that were using it, and it cost something like $10,000 or $20,000 a license. It's quite an expensive server at the time, and that's in 1994 money. So they wrote to me and said that I was infringing on their trademark on the name SMB server, and could I please change the name to something else? And so I needed a new name fast. So I wanted to do it instantly, and so all I did was I looked through. I'd learned about egrep just recently, and so I used egrep to look for this pattern in user-dict words on my Sun system to find any word containing S and M and B, because that's the protocol name. And I really had a choice of salmonberry or Samba. And I decided Samba was a better name than salmonberry.
Good choice.
So, these days, the user-dict words is much bigger and there's a lot more choices. There weren't many choices in that old Sun system.
The salmonberry's still available, right?
Yes, the Salmonberry project. Yes, go for it. Blackberry. Yes. So 5 years later, I got another email from the same people at Syntax Corp telling me that they really regretted sending that first email because Samba was a much better name. And by that stage, their product was largely, their market had been taken over by Samba. And people were using Samba rather than their product. So they had made a bad mistake in pushing me away from the SMB server name.
Are there any problems caused by the fact that rather than working out the protocol from a release documentation, you did it by sniffing out the Wireshark stuff, which is kind of like reverse engineering?
There's a lot of discussions of that. It's not strictly speaking reverse engineering. Well, it depends on what you call reverse engineering. We usually call reverse engineering the Samba team when you disassemble something. You look inside somebody else's code, right? Look inside their binaries. That I'd classify as reverse engineering. Whereas looking on the wire, we call that network analysis. There is a subtle difference, and it can be important for some of the end-user license agreements of various products. When I was first doing it, I was afraid that some company might think that what I'd done was bad, And so I actually contacted the local Digital Equipment Corporation people here in Canberra, and I asked them, did they have any objections to me releasing this package, which I had worked out by watching the interactions between their Digital Equipment Corporation client and their DEC PathWorks server. And the response from the local person here in DEC, the local manager, was that it's perfectly legal what you did, it's a little silly, but it's perfectly legal. And they thought it was silly because they said, there's a specification, you know, you could have just read the spec. And so I then went and looked for the spec, and he pointed me at this spec called Net Bias, right, and was available in these RFCs, request for comment documentation, called RFC 2001 and 2002, I think the numbers are, or was it 1001? I think it's 2001, 2002, from memory. And I read those RFCs, and they didn't look anything like what I'd implemented, so I thought he was just silly himself, and I thought he didn't know what he was talking about. Later I discovered that he did know what he was talking about, and the net bias specification only covered the first 4 bytes of each packet. It was what's called the encapsulation for each packet. Then what it encapsulated was the session protocol called SMB, and there's separate documentation for that. But I didn't find that separate documentation until years later, when I started thinking about renaming it to SMB, when somebody pointed out that I really had been silly, and in fact there was a document available that explained the SMB protocol, although the documentation was full of errors, and it didn't cover all of the protocol. But anyway, yes, there's always been this debate as to whether there's anything that is illegal about Samba. We have always erred on the side of caution using techniques that are clearly legal in every jurisdiction. And we've had legal advice and things on that, and there hasn't been any issues at all. But yeah, it's an interesting point, and you do have to be careful that you don't tread on anyone's toes or violate any EULAs or do anything that might be illegal, otherwise it might prejudice your project later. When it's a small project, you might think it doesn't matter, but sometimes small projects become big projects, and then you might actually care. Yeah.
The deck guy might think you're being silly, but analysing what's actually going on the wire is a lot more fun. And,
yes, it's great fun.
And actually reveals the truth rather than someone's interpretation of what should be going on in the wire.
Although the code also ends up being very strange. I mean, I've got a minute, I'll show you some of that early code, right? What's the earliest version I've got? Server 0.5. So there's a lot of code here where what I do is I just work out, I saw in the network sniffer, I wrote my own little network sniffer so I could capture the packets. I didn't realise there were available network sniffers, so I sort of wrote one. And the code looks like this, you know, the out size for this packet is always 39. Why? I didn't know. Put at byte offset 8, the value from the buffer that came in at offset 8. It always seemed to be the same on the input and the output, so I just copied that byte. I didn't know what it meant. Put it at offset 28, the value from in buff 28. Put it offset 0, the byte swapped version of the size -4. Right? I just sort of observed this, right? And I didn't know what it was doing. So this code is complete gobbledygook. It worked, but it doesn't understand the structure of the protocol at all. You know, always put 1 at offset 9 in the packet. Put the error code at offset 11. So it was terrible code. If I'd used a specification, it would have been much nicer code. But it was also fun. It's great fun doing that sort of thing. Looking at, you know, it's a detective game. You stare at the packets and you try to work out what's going on and how to make it work. And that sort of detective game can really spur people on to do good stuff. And whereas implementing from a specification, that's more boring. So part of the idea is to have fun, right? So yes, doing it the fun way can be the better way to do it.
So that was server.c?
That's the only C file, yes.
Yeah, but I was just noticing it had the hard-coded constant SMB in it. Even back
Yeah, that was in 0. Oh yes, but I'd noticed that this SMB was always in every packet, right? But I didn't know why. I didn't know that was the name of the protocol, right? I just noticed that these letters, and in fact, this 255, you know, 377 octal, and SMB was always at the start of every packet. And I thought, what's that for? You know, I'll just copy it. I'll just put it in, whatever those bytes happen to be, and I discovered later that's the name of the protocol. Yes, well spotted.
But at least doing it that way, it's going to work.
Yeah, but it doesn't cope with changes. I mean, somebody tries to do a different operation never seen before, and the server just puts back some garbage.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then I guess that's the incremental way in which you learn how it works.
That's right. Yeah. So that's how it works. Okay, so commercial adoption. It caught the attention of network attached storage vendors about 1995, and because previous to that, there were NAS vendors before 1995, but they were all using proprietary implementations of this protocol, either ones they've written themselves or ones that they've bought and licensed from some other company. And here was a chance to lower their costs. They could just use the one that I released and include it in their product, and hey, that lowered they didn't have to pay a licensing fee, didn't have to pay their own engineers to work on it, and NAS boxes started coming out. And initially, the NAS vendors didn't send many patches, they just used it. Right? That's fine, they're allowed to. The license says they can use it, absolutely fine. One of the things you need to do in the free software community is not be upset when people use your code for their profit. That's fine. That's what, if your license says that they can do it, then you should expect that some people will do that and won't contribute back. Right? But years later, the NAS vendors ended up being some of the largest contributors. When it became a bigger and more important part of their product, they started contributing back. And many of the Samba team members are now employed by NAS vendors. But for the first few years, they didn't do much. They just used it. That's fine. Unix vendors, various Unix vendors started getting interested. I started receiving free machines in the post. So sort of some Unix boxes started arriving here in the department or at home. And these days I ask them not to send one because I prefer they put it on their network so they pay for the electricity. Because my electricity bill started going up when I had all these, big servers sitting up in my house.
But the noise.
Yes, the noise as well was, yes, my wife did prefer that the servers were somewhere else. It started shipping with various Unix variants, so these vendors started shipping it either on these auxiliary CDs, these sort of side CDs, or it started shipping with free Unixes, or sometimes as embedded as part of the main Unix product. Just depended on how scared they were of the GNU General Public License. In those days, around 95 or so, a lot of companies were still very wary of this free software thing. It might contaminate them in some way, it might be toxic, their lawyers didn't really understand it. Why are people doing it? They're suspicious because they didn't understand. And so they often put it on an extra CD to isolate it away from their main system, just in case it jumps out and does something nasty to their main system. Most of the Unix vendors have now understood that it's not that toxic, really they can incorporate it, and many of them have now incorporated it into their main distributions.
Did you have to do much work here with getting the license included like that?
In these days, around 1995, we were starting to occasionally ask them, oh, make sure you include the GPL in your documentation, make sure you mention it's GPL'd. We only had one real incident around that time frame where somebody breached the license badly. That's one I mentioned the other day, where this company was this scam artist type company. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But really, there weren't that many issues. We also weren't that very active and aware of these types of issues. Partly because not many of the Unix vendors were contributing much back, so we didn't sort of understand the potential for them to make contributions, so we didn't really understand why it was important to make them aware that they had to contribute back. Because I was still learning about free software. I was still trying to understand exactly how the process worked. And so it was a learning exercise for everyone involved, really. Okay, so the biggest interest really came from the growing GNU Linux community. So a whole lot of people in the Linux community started using Samba as a way to connect the Windows and the and Linux systems, and it became a very, very popular product. So Microsoft also started getting interested. Sun Microsystems had announced a thing called WebNFS, which was basically their attempt to bring NFS to the World Wide Web. They thought, file sharing on the web. You won't use this, HTTP URL. You'll instead have some application in your box and you directly connect to anonymous NFS file servers all over the world to share files. That'll be much better than this silly HTTP thing, right? So this WebNFS thing started getting pushed. Microsoft thought they had to react to that. Microsoft suddenly discovered the internet. Right? They discovered, hey, there's this network all around us, and gosh, we don't control it. What are we going to do? They decided that all their products had to be internet-enabled. So what they did was they renamed their SMB implementation to CIFS, because the second letter is an I, which stood for internet. Right? So by renaming it and calling it the Common Internet File System, that put the internet stamp on that product, like on many of their other products, made it internet-enabled. And so Microsoft was very interested in showing that they interoperated with another SMB implementation. And so they invited us to the first CIFS conference up in Seattle, and they paid for some of us to fly there. And you know, here I was, a poor student, you know, at home, you know, all my bookshelves made out of bricks and planks from the dump, this sort of thing, eating pizza and, you know, on a essentially zero income, because by this stage, of course, my PhD scholarship had run out. They only last a few years, unfortunately. And so they actually flew me business class to Seattle, gave me a rented car, and put me up at the best hotels, and it was quite an experience for a you know, young PhD student, and it was quite amazing. And some Microsoft executives sort of took us to one side and, you know, wondered about, you know, had we ever thought about working for Microsoft, this sort of thing. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, so none of us said yes to the jobs. So they started getting interested, and we were invited to the first CIFS conference, and we gave talks at that conference, and we've attended those conferences every year ever since. We've run some of those conferences. We tend to run the Plugfest now, and these days, more than half, often 2/3 of the companies that turn up to these conferences are running some variant of Samba. So in the beginning, there was just us little thing, and all these other companies that were playing in this interoperability, and we were these little ones in the corner. And now we, you know, dominate at some of these conferences. And Microsoft, of course, dominates in the actual deployed numbers of copies of this thing, but the technical discussions in the community, the Samba team plays a significant role these days. Yeah, Bob.
So you mentioned a variant of Samba. In what ways is Samba, is it forks, or are they?
Often it's just vendors who are using it. Some of them make additions. For example, Apple often turns up and they've got their own variant of Samba. They contribute the changes back, they make them available, but sometimes those changes may not be suitable for everyone. They're only suitable for Mac OS, and so we might not integrate them immediately. We might have to have some discussion to work out how to integrate it. Also, companies often add their own wrappers around it for graphical user interfaces or administration tools and that sort of thing, which makes it a little bit different to use than it is on other platforms. And so these vendors all turn up, and they all want to check they interoperate with each other to make sure they haven't broken anything, to make sure it all still works together. So we have these plug fests and conferences around the product. So that was in 1996, we had that first CIFS conference, and it was a great experience. It was really amazing. So Samba team, by mid-1996, Samba was taking up most of my time. And it was about this stage where I was pulled into the head of the Faculty of Engineering's office, and I was given a good talking to about how I wasn't getting my thesis done and how future employers would never hire me because I was clearly a sort of person who got things done late and left them to the last minute. So I was given a good talking to. Anyway, there were lots of contributors. It was a very active mailing list, and I was loving doing it. But I realised that I had to be able to split up the task of managing this project between multiple people. I had to not just have one central person, or I was never going to get my thesis done, and I was never going to do anything but Samba. So we decided, a few of us got together at my house. There was a number of other Samba team members in Australia, and they came up to Canberra, and we had some pizza and sat around at my house one evening, and we decided to form something called the Samba team in May 1996. And we decided to move to a source code management system. By this stage, I'd learnt what CVS was and the wonders that it could do. And we decided to adopt CVS, and that meant that we decided that anyone who was a member of the Samba team would be able to commit to CVS immediately without going via me, without getting my permission to put the patch in. And it's, you know, it's good and bad. It's good in that it means there's less work on one developer. It can be bad because it means that there isn't one person who understands the entire project scrutinising every patch. We still did code review and looked at each other's patches, but there was a slightly lower level of scrutiny. And so projects that do manage to have the one developer still providing the control can end up with higher quality code and more consistent code, but it can cause that developer to burn out. They can get overloaded. Anyway, so we had public CVS read access. We decided that team membership was going to be by invitation, so we'd invite new members, and it led to even faster development. And a whole lot of other people started contributing even more because all the other people who'd been contributing for years, who then became the core team, the original Samba team, those people then started encouraging more people to contribute, and they also felt as though they had a bigger part to play in the project. They were now Samba team members, which they proudly put in their signatures. right, or on their resumes. And it gave them a sense of belonging to the project, which they didn't have previously. So it was great, because they were doing most of the work by this stage. So they really deserved the recognition. So the first legal scuffle happened in 1997, where I mentioned this one at a previous talk. There's a small US company tried to sell Samba as their own work. They sort of tried to claim that they wrote it all. They filed all their copyrights off, changed all the names of the authors and claimed they wrote it. Very dirty tactics. And the Samba team, we got quite upset about this. Because we got upset really because they weren't crediting us with the work. They were claiming it was their work. And they also did some very shifty things. When we tried to talk to them, they used these strange legal tactics and things. And they were just scam artists, right? But it upset us. And it was the first time we'd met people who were trying to take advantage of the work we'd done in a nasty way. So it upset us in a way that, you know, perhaps more than it should have. Anyway, so we were helped. This is the first time we got in touch with Evan Moglen, who is the pro bono attorney, the external counsel for the Free Software Foundation, and the leading light of lawyers in the free software world. And he offered to provide us with free legal assistance, and he was brilliant. The amount of time he put in was quite amazing. He solved the issue, and the company backed down, and they wrote an apology letter eventually, after much legal fighting, where they apologised for the inadvertent inclusion of some of our code in one of their products. The fact that it was all of their code in their only product was, well, anyway, it was good enough. They put up this letter and they backed down. So copyright registration, at that point, that led to us having, as I explained the other day, to us having to register the copyright with the Library of Congress, and that led, it was one of the major factors in the current Samba copyright policy that we have of non-corporate copyright. And you can see some more details on that on the Samba development website explaining exactly what the legal reasons are for having that policy. Next major incident, and I emphasise again that major incidents only happen every few years. Usually it was just each day, do a bit of code, contribute, test stuff, do a new release, that sort of thing. The next large incident happened with a major contributor called Luke Layton. He started contributing in mid-1996, and he did some really excellent work. He made a lot of contributions over a period of 4 years. He particularly worked initially on the NMBD, which is the name server portion of Samba, and later on the NT4 domain support. He had a lot of energy and did a lot of work. But we got some disagreements in around 1999 on engineering approaches, which direction we should take with the project. He wanted to take it down a particular engineering approach, and most of the rest of the team, including myself and most of the other contributors, wanted to take it down a different approach. And we couldn't come to an agreement, and so Luke decided, we initially created a separate CVS branch for him to work in, so we could work within the project in the hope that we could eventually come to an agreement and merge some of his code in and come to a common project that would achieve both goals. The continued agreements led to him doing a full fork in October 2000. So he created the Samba TNG project, which still exists, but it's not very active. There's very few commits happening to it. And so it hasn't continued on as lively as the main Samba project. And that it can happen either way with forks. You know, it can be that both projects flourish. It can be that the original one flourishes and this one, the fork doesn't, which is what happened in this case. It could be that the fork flourishes and the original one doesn't. And it really just depends on the energy and enthusiasm of the developers to get around the new fork and to push it in the direction that they want. So the project still exists. If you have a look at Samba TNG, you can see the project. You can see the announcement of the fork. I put up a letter where I was announcing, saying that I'm glad to see that they're taking the project in that direction, they're exploring new horizons. You need to be friendly. You don't want the fork to be too acrimonious. You want it to be as friendly as possible. And so we had very much as friendly as we could, given the disagreements that we had. Okay, book fever started in around 1999. A person called John Blair wrote a book on Samba. And we were thinking, gosh, no one wants to read a book on Samba. There's only, it's only a few thousand users. We didn't know how many users we had. We had no idea. We didn't count the users, we didn't count downloads. We counted downloads on the main site, but at this stage we had probably 20 or 30 mirror sites around the world in all different countries. We had no idea how many people were actually using it. And so we were rather sceptical. And we were just stunned when it became the top-selling book for several months on the Amazon IT sales, right, in the IT section. The top seller for months. I thought, my God, there's people who want to use this stuff, people who want to read about it. Wow, our documentation must be terrible if everyone wants to buy the book. So we were good and bad about the book being so popular, because it did mean our docs really were terrible. Anyway, a whole lot of other publishers saw this book at the #1 and thought, what's this Samba thing? Why is dancing so popular? And they thought, my God, it's an IT book. What's this Samba thing? And a whole lot of other publishers then wanted to create books. So we saw an explosion of books. Within about 2 years, there were 20 books on Samba from every publisher had a book on Samba. And Samba team members regularly received emails from publishers saying, hi, we'll give you a commission in advance if you write a book on Samba. People who didn't even know what Samba was got emails like that if they'd written previous books. And some of them actually wrote books. Some of those 20 books were written by people who didn't know anything about Samba. And you could tell by reading the book. It's a terrible book, some of them. Some of them were really good. One in particular, one written by Jerry Carter, was this brilliant book, Teach Yourself Samba in 24 Hours by, the publisher was I think called Sam's?
Yeah.
Yeah, and very, very well written book. And he then started doing lecture tours, basically teaching Samba at conferences based on the material from his book. And it was the best written book I've seen on Samba. He's an extraordinarily talented person at presenting complex ideas in an easy to understand way. And anyway, many of those books were of dubious quality. Now there's even more books on Samba. And although we've also got much better documentation, a number of people who wrote books decided to follow the free software line and publish their books for free download. And one of those, the Riley publishers were convinced to allow us to incorporate the book into our documentation. So now one of the books is available as part of the Samba documentation for free download, which is great. So that means our documentation has been greatly improved. So Samba then turned into my career in around 1999, 2000 or so. Lots of FOSS programmers were in high demand. Many of the Samba team members were already working full-time on Samba for various employers, hardware manufacturers, NAS companies, etc. I went to visit the US in May 99 and I gave some talks at 5 well-known companies in the Linux space, and all of them offered me jobs, which was great. And so I ended up starting to work for Linux Care here in Canberra. We started a division of Linux Care here in Canberra, and we ended up hiring a whole bunch of other Linux developers from all over Australia who came to Canberra to work on free software together. And so that's been a really great experience being able to work on with that group, the OzLabs group. Most of that group is now working for IBM here in Canberra still as OzLabs. Or we think of ourselves as OzLabs. Bug tracking. Samba started with a simple mailing list. All our bug tracking was just people mailed the mailing list. Many of the users were also developers at that time, so it was quite suitable. Then I wanted a bug tracking system. There were several bug tracking systems available, but I didn't like any of them. Like many programmers, you tend to think very highly of yourself. You think, I can do better than that. And so I thought, well, I'll go and create my own bug tracking system. And I can make it more web-based and more friendly for people. So I created a project called Jitterbug, which is the bug tracking system in 1997. And quite a few other projects adopted it. It's still used by 100 or 200 projects around the world, but it's not nearly as popular as BugTrack and other ones. Bugzilla, sorry, not BugTrack, Bugzilla. BugTrack is a mailing list, that's security. Bugzilla is the bug tracking system. But I've largely abandoned Jitterbug because it didn't scale well. But the design I had for it was great when the project was reasonably small, but Samba grew. And once the project had sort of tens of thousands of bug reports and things accumulated over the years, Jitterbug started really breaking apart and not working well. And so we abandoned it and we switched to Bugzilla in May 2003, which was available back when I wrote Jitterbug, but it had greatly improved since then. We were happy to use it. And so now we're still using Bugzilla to this day, which Bugzilla is a bug tracking system written by the Mozilla project, Firefox, that brought you Firefox. And of course they were used to very large scales. They were a much more popular project with a lot more bugs to deal with. And so they made their project really scale well. Source code management, we started off, as I mentioned, with tarballs and emailed patches from 1992 to 96. In 96, we switched over to CVS with public CVS access, and we kept that until 2004. In 2004, we switched to Subversion when that came out as a better CVS with public SVN access. Some of the developers used BZR SVK, and some of the Samba team members even wrote extensions to BZR and other tools to allow them to interface to Subversion. So Jelmer Venugi in the Netherlands has been a particularly active Samba team member, and he's extraordinary in that he works on so many projects. He's a very, very active student, again, extremely talented programmer, and he wrote a whole lot of code to interface, for example, BZR to the SVN repository, and to interface things like BZR and Git and other source code management systems. From 2008 onwards, we switched over to Git. We decided that the distributed source code management tools really were the way to go, and Git looked to be the one that, well, it was the one that was most popular within the team. I had some reservations about switching to Git because I thought that BZR was a bit easier to use, but since we've adopted Git, I think it was the right decision among the team to choose Git because it has been an excellent tool for the Samba development. Really, really good bug tracking system. Not bug tracking system, source code management system. I didn't have enough coffee this morning. The full history since 1996 has been imported, so since the time when we switched to CVS, all of that history is imported. Beyond that, you just see an initial import of all the code up to 1996, the early code that was done by tarballs. We could try and get the history back further than that by doing diffs between releases, but nobody's bothered to do that. You can still see it though in the old versions directory. So, child projects, Samba has led to a whole lot of other projects being created. This is one of the things that tends to happen with older projects. Within the project, you create little libraries or utilities to help the project. And those little libraries and utilities grow up and get a life of their own, right? Go and move out and work with other projects and get adopted by other projects. So these are some of the ones that have come out of the Samba project. There's others. These are the ones I've been particularly involved with, but there's others that many other Samba team developers helped develop. Like I mentioned, Jelmer's work with BZR integration with SVN and many other little projects like that. So the TDB is the trivial database. That's a little database we wrote when we needed a database abstraction in Samba, and that's used by a number of other projects now. When you connect using PPP, so if you connect with an ADSL modem that's based on Linux, which a whole lot of them are, underneath is actually a little embedded TDB database inside that that's helping PPP do its job. It's used in quite a few projects like that. Talc is a hierarchical memory management system that's used by a number of projects. It tries to make memory management in C programs a little easier to cope with, and it's been a great success in the Samba project, although it is a little bit hard to understand when you first use it. LDB is a lightweight LDAP implementation. We needed that for creating the Active Directory implementation in the latest development branch of Samba, Samba version 4. And there's now some other projects that have adopted that. So the Open Change server that you're having a look at the moment, your project to create a replacement for an Exchange server, Microsoft Exchange server, that's using the LDB database underneath, for example, to store the information. All of the users and all of their accounts, etc. libSMB client is an SMB client library, but that's now used by numerous other projects. libReplace is a little portability layer. That's quite recent, and it's only been adopted by 2 or 3 other projects. Not very many have used it just yet. T-Event is also quite new. It's an event handling layer for C programmers, and that's used by a couple of projects, most notably CTDB uses it extensively. CTDB is a clustered version of TDB that's used to create sophisticated clustered transactional databases. So various tools that have come out of the project, the Jitterbug bug tracking system, which is pretty much defunct now. The P-Server public CVS module to try to make anonymous CVS more secure, and it's completely redundant now because people are not really adopting CVS much anymore. The BZRSVN module. HIDL was an IDL compiler. It's a Perl-based IDL compiler that helps us build our C code from IDL files, so source code generation. Yep.
IDL.
IDL is the interface definition language. It's a file that describes remote procedure call interfaces between two computers, and the IDL compiler will generate C code that implements the client library and the stubs for the server so that you can quickly write remote procedure calls that are compatible with other systems' remote procedure calls, in particular the Microsoft remote procedure call system. The build farm, I've shown you that in the talk about source code management systems. We have this build farm, and that's now been adopted for some other projects, which is great, plus the build farm that we host on Samba.org hosts about 10 or 12 projects in it, hosted directly on Samba.org, and they utilise our build farm. So there's also other related projects. There's a whole bunch of management tools. If you look for Samba and GUI on FreshMeat or other projects, you do see a whole lot of people have written better management tools. And this really points out another weakness. I said when the book came out on Samba, it pointed out our documentation was bad. When a whole lot of people started to write management tools for Samba, we realised our management tools were bad. And so I made an attempt to write a management tool called SWAT, and it really showed up how poor I am at GUI programming and interface programming. I really need to do a human interface course or something and learn a bit more about it, because it's quite a terrible interface. Anyway, it's still used by some people. If you're reading this using SWAT, my apologies. If you're listening to this anyway. So a whole lot of those management tools have sprung up, whole NAS, free NAS projects to create a whole NAS system based on free software. They've sprung up with their own management tools, and a whole bunch of other projects have sprung up to manage Samba. Each of those, of course, is a FOSS project in their own right. Plus, there's more major projects using Samba. The OpenChange implementation is a FOSS implementation of the Exchange protocols. At its core is a whole lot of Samba code to make that happen. The OpenNAS and FreeNAS, which are free software NAS projects, both of those have at their core some Samba code, as well as lots of other code, of course, from many, many other free software projects. Heimdall, who've been working very closely with Love from Sweden, who's the author of the Heimdall implementation of Kerberos, and we've now tightly integrated Heimdall with the latest development branch of Samba, and it's been a very productive collaboration we've had between Heimdall and the Samba project, with patches going both ways. The SMBFS CIFS project, which is the client file system built into the Linux kernel that allows you to mount CIFS and SMB servers. One of the Samba team members, Steve French, looks after the current implementation of that, and he's very active in the team and cooperating. Even though it's a separate project, we cooperate quite strongly on test tools and protocol discussions. So that's about it. That brings us up to the current day with Samba. I just wanted to give that as a case study of what happens with can happen with a FOSS project over the years. That small additional announcement can lead to something quite large. So if you guys are all inspired to start your own project, then you could be in for a real ride. It can lead to changing your life, and it's really can be a lot of fun. But make sure you enjoy it. Work on FOSS because you enjoy it. That way, it's far more likely to be successful. If you don't enjoy the coding, you'll give it up. And so choose something that you really enjoy, and that you will enjoy hacking on, you'll enjoy working with other people on, and then you'll have a good project. Right, so now we've got morning tea, and then we've got the first lab, where you should be starting to get prepared, ready for your presentations tomorrow. Make sure you've done all the right research for your projects so that you have something to present tomorrow. Thanks very much.